Hello, everybody, and welcome to Foolish Musings. This is episode 13. I'm Tim, here with Sam and Simon, and today we're going to talk about the topic of beer. Right now, I am drinking, well, I'm not going to say what particular brand because I'm not getting paid to, but a pale ale, and it is 11 o'clock in the morning, and that is the perfect time to be drinking a beer on a Sunday. Anyway, I'm going to crack on and start, and we'll talk a little bit about the history of beer from its earliest beginnings. And this is primarily derived actually from the first couple of chapters of a book called The History of the World in Four Glasses, and that talks about different beverages throughout history. And beer being one of the earliest, I suppose, besides water, but really, who's going to drink water? Essentially, in early Mesopotamia, so we're talking now over 5,000 to 6,000 years from now. Before there was the primary crop of wheat and barley being grown for the purposes of making bread, and these were the first urban settlements that people came into and were living in. And so, at some stage during this period, bread eventually became beer. Through a process of probably somebody just leaving some grains out and accidentally allowing them to ferment. It's pretty low alcohol content, wouldn't have had any hops, wouldn't have lasted very long, but it was a good way of providing an alternate mechanism of getting access to calories while at the same time being presented potentially with somewhat toxic water, depending on where you were living at the time. Now, what is interesting, I suppose, from the history, because that's relatively boring in some ways, is actually where we cheers or why we cheers. So, in this early period, beer was generally brewed in large vats, and there would be a lot of sediment that would come to the top. And so, what you'd have is basically a straw, which you would punch through the sediment, and then you drink the beer from this large vat. And generally speaking, people would drink beers together because you're not going to drink a giant vat of beer by yourself. And what this meant was that there was an implicit trust, not only in the brewing skill of the individual making the beer, but also with regards to potential poisoning of materials, etc., that all of you were sharing from the same bowl, all of you sharing from the same vat, and therefore it was a very communal, social thing to do. And so it's hypothesized in this book that potentially that's where cheers comes from. When we hold up our beers together, or any other kind of beverage, and clink them together, we are once again hearkening back to that once upon a time where we all shared from the same vat, from the same beverage, and there was that implicit trust between the group that we had necessarily poisoned each other, but also that we were all partaking in a common meal and a common drink. So I suppose what I'll do is I'll throw out to the rest of you guys now and say, well, I suppose I just want to have a discussion about how does beer in particular, but beverages more broadly, continue to provide a mechanism for us to come together in a social context? And I'll throw first to Simon.
Cool. I actually had a cool thing I was going to mention, but I didn't realize you weren't going to mention it. So originally, brewing was actually the job of a lot of women in the groups, and they had a particular hat and a particular style that was associated specifically with brewing. But when the Christian church and Catholic church became particularly popular, they wanted to corner that side of the market so they could actually have more funds for particular monasteries and whatnot. So they handed over to monks, and then the association with witches is actually the aesthetic that the brewing women had, and that was sort of their thing to make money. So I don't know how that fits in, but yeah, I particularly found that interesting.
Fair enough. Yes, damn those women trying to control our beers. Yet another example of the old patriarchy. Sam?
Well, I wonder if that ties in with witches and worts, a wort being the fermenting product or whatever to the beer, the starter as such. And it's 10 o'clock in Queensland, so I'm not sure I'm going to drink a beer yet, but an XPA is what I'll be having once we hit a more reasonable time to drink. I wonder as well if the beer's social function is because of its weaker concentration. So you can consume more of it in a social, say, spirits. If we were like the Russians and drank spirits socially, we probably would get a lot drunker a lot faster. Whereas with a beer, you can spread a few beers over a day and such, and you have the social inhibition to a small degree, but not the extreme negatives of being drunk.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a aspect of beer's attraction as opposed to other harder beverages. Even wine, I suppose, is significantly stronger than beer in that regard. Um, One of the things I suppose that's interesting to when you brought that up is I'm thinking about when spirits became introduced at a reasonably wholesale level in the Americas throughout the British colonies and then into what would become eventually the United States. You had significant issues in regards to the consumption of alcohol because a lot of people who have been used to drinking very weak beer by even these days standards, but like in huge quantities because that was the done thing. And then when whiskey became available, that same drinking culture led to huge amounts of excess. And actually, in some regards, is kind of like the foundation of the temperance movement in the US. And then if you look at another example of a culture which had a very heavy drinking sort of tradition, but with a weak alcohol moving to a stronger alcohol, you can actually look at the Mongols. And as the Mongols, who essentially drank fermented mare's milk in copious quantities throughout their history, moved into China and then had access to stronger alcohols, they had a similar thing. And it's actually recorded by Chinese court historians, the issues that the early Mongol monarchs had dealing with the stronger alcohol of the Chinese culture and countryside. So I suppose in some ways, drinking cultures of themselves develop in a very specific context with regards to the beverages that are available to them, and then when that beverages changes, or when the availability of the alcohol or other potentially inhibition reducing substances, because access to other forms of narcotics is potentially another route out if you're going to look at drinking. That can potentially have deleterious or destructive effects on the society. What do you think, Sam?
I definitely would say it's a very strong trend, like you pointed out there. But I'd be hesitant to say that beer doesn't have a negative impact on society. Like as an Australian, we have an awful issue with alcohol and violence, and beer is by far the most drunk alcohol in Australia. I think it's possibly the third most drunk liquid in Australia. So it definitely, has its negative, but I don't know if you can really blame the substance for that as such. It's just a couple of carbons and an oxygen getting around with some hydrogen. It's not going to be terribly responsible for its actions, but yeah, beer definitely has a dark side as such.
Yeah, so I suppose one thing I would ask then is that I've heard it argued by particularly radical feminists that potentially the world would be a better place if there was just less testosterone, because they would argue that testosterone causes violence. And on the other hand, I have heard argued by a bioethicist, and I can't particularly remember his name, I think it's Seltzer, I'll link him in after this, basically that it's not necessarily that the testosterone causes violence, but testosterone does exacerbate existing or underlying aggressive tendencies within an organism. So potentially, if you look at alcohol that way, it's a cultural issue, but the booze really brings out the flaw in the system.
Yeah, just to say, I think the link between testosterone and violence is incredibly tenuous at best. Especially because you don't see an uptick in violent behavior in F2M transitions. So if that was, if testosterone led to violence, you would see people becoming more aggressive when they, had a gender change surgery or some such. But you just don't see that. So I don't actually necessarily buy into the science that testosterone causes aggression. It may be that people with high testosterone have a cofactor that are more likely to make them aggressive or some such, but I don't buy into it being testosterone itself.
Anyway, so I'm gonna say some stuff. So yes, me with my with my studies have sort of dipped my toe in sociology / social psychology, and I had a particular professor who did evolutionary psychology, and he found it really interesting that testosterone by itself doesn't actually have any major effect on whether somebody's violent or not violent, but it's like all these other elements. So, for example, a lot of pubs and clubs well, specifically clubs, have this thing where they put like loud music on and they do a bunch of other things. And it's supposed to like create this sort of thing of like infatuation, which means that people stay there longer. But unfortunately, it also is very close to infatuation, is also very close to violence. So it's a combination of thing, and then also it's a combination of that sort of like high-end music with that like makes you pump up, with a combination of they found temperature had a massive effect. So if they actually cool down the clubs, so I don't know, you guys probably haven't been to a club in donkey's years, but you'll find they'll actually try and cool down the whole entire thing because they found out that if you have high temperatures, tempers are more likely to flare.
Sorry, just quick, was that thermal temperature, Simon? As in, like, the actual temperature of the building itself?
Yeah, that's actually the thermal temperature has a actual effect on tempers flaring and whatnot.
Super interesting. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what is it? It's very interesting to see the confluence of environmental factors and how that can eventually lead to specific societal behavior. Anyway, I think Sam was actually going to talk a little bit more about beer specifically. I know we've drifted a little bit off the topic there, but carry it away, Sam.
Yep. So I'm very going to beer is a interesting beverage. Because say, you take wine, right? If it's sealed properly and like properly isolated from the environment, wine in theory, ages, blah de blah, and doesn't actually stop tasting okay. If wine from the Roman age was dug up and it was properly sealed, it would actually, not be vinegar, it would be still wine. But not much else goes on with it, You can have corkage and the like, but that's from a failure to isolate it from the environment. Beer, however, is actually massively unstable. And I think it's in large part because of the huge amount of compounds that actually go into providing the experience or taste of a beer. But, so exposure to light. That's why beer bottles are all dark colors. Or, in a tin, which is completely transparent. No, the opposite.
Opaque.
Translucent. Yeah, opaque. Thank you. Oh, my God. I'm not a scientist. And it can actually break down these the compounds from the hops, which are isohomylone, and it'll break them down to thiol compounds that actually they're described as skunkiness. So this intrinsic aspect of beer, the hop, actually can break down in the final vessel, which in most other beverages, the final product is a stable product. So beer is very interesting like this.
I was just wondering, what's the impact of, well, we've seen with a lot of smaller craft breweries now, like double and triple hopped beers. Does this really have a massive impact with regards to the breaking down of those molecules? Or like, does it reach a certain point of saturation and then like the molecules won't break down further?
I don't really know what you mean. So like, say a triple hopped beer is just going to have an awful lot more of isohomylone, and that's what gives beer a bitter flavor. That's actually 1 part per million of isohomylone is 1 international bitterness unit. So, if it has an IBO of 100, that's 100 parts per million of isohomylone in a beer. It would make the beers more susceptible if they were, say, in a container that light can get to. They would break down faster. But most beers are intentionally stored to prevent them being exposed to light for this exact reason. Simon?
However, is it like that there's multiple elements like conflicting? Is that what gives the bitter taste, or is it that it's just the aging of the different components that result in the thing, the negative effects?
Okay, so in beer itself, I keep forgetting if I've unmuted myself. The isohomylone gives the bitter flavor of hops, and that's a positive. That's what we desire. But it can react with under the presence of UV with sulfur-containing compounds, such as like cysteine or something, and creates, I apologize for this big old name, folks, 3-methyl-2-ene-1-thiol, which tastes shitty. And so it's just the beer under the exposure to light starts to break down to form these compounds because of the aspect that gives beer the bitter flavor. There's actually like 1,000 things that can go wrong with beer, though. It's not just this one skunkiness. Like there are, what is it called? Oh, I've forgotten its name. 2-nonenal in beer as it just ages. So like this is just most likely it's caused by free oxygen in the beer itself. So radicals breaking down the aromatic compounds, but they break down to 2-nonenal, and it actually makes the beer taste like the smell of cardboard. You know, and all this other weird shit. And it still goes on in every beer. You know, no beer is going to be hermetically sealed. Well, not even that. Like contain no air. So all beers do degrade, which is quite an interesting thing because no other alcohol product does. Tim?
So that's quite interesting. I suppose I was going to ask you for some practical advice. How long can I keep my beer before it sort of becomes no longer taste viable? And does that vary considerably on the basis of what type of beer or how that beer is brewed?
So brewing would definitely have an impact because the more controlled, which is like a shame because I fucking hate mass-produced industrialized beers because they all taste the exact same. However, they all taste the exact same because the degree to control within the process. So you're going to have far fewer impurities. But the easiest way to tell how long a beer is going to last approximately is, say you got a tinny, tip it over sideways, and it'll say on the bottle. Pretty nifty. I'm funny. But pretty much most beers have quite a short shelf life. So like don't try and age your beer, don't try and store your beer. Drink your beer. Yeah, on the subject I guess of beer technologies, we might jump to Simon because I'm done.
Hell yeah, that's my section. Woot, 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 woot. Anyway, so pretty much I was like, what's actually happening? What's the going thing with beer? Because like we're all talking about beer and like, you know, it's talking about like the ancient times, we're talking about like the techniques, but like what's like the big deal? So as we were discussing with craft beers, yes, they have unique tastes, but they don't have as long shelf life, which had a major issue when it comes to the environmental impact of all these small breweries pumping out waste, because obviously when you're making beer, not everything gets used, so there has to actually be stuff that's put back into the environment. So there's this massive this one's a bit of a muddied case because it sort of relates to everything that's relating to environmental issues. So for example, it talks about like, you know, they're not using fossil fuels and stuff, but yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. Food waste called toast ale is apparently a major issue when it comes to, which is a 1/3 of the barley is used typically to brew bread, so otherwise is wasted, so they don't actually usually use it. They just sort of chuck it out. There's also surplus potatoes and a bunch of other stuff that's used in the process, and because a lot of times they don't use it for the other elements that it used to be used back in the day, it sort of just gets chucked out and wasted. That's from a lovely article from... is this 2020? No, this is the 2019 one, which was a environmental challenges brought up by beer production. Then there's the one that I also found that was... Is this one this year? I know one of these is a 2021. This was another 2019 one. And this also discusses the thing that Sam was mentioning about UV light and whatnot, and how they're going to use it as a... they're using infrared stereoscopiers to predict dozens and hundreds of components simultaneously in the brewing process to make it so that a lot of these more like more volatile beers can actually be like... So it's so that they don't release a bad batch. It's sort of so they can keep an eye on it as the brewing process is occurring and be able to release a beer that's a bit more consistent, like all the mass-produced beers, without, you know, running too much of a risk, so they can have the optimal craft beer every single time. But it's also being used in all parts of the beer industry. It's not just craft beer. And then finally, the one from this current year, which I thought was pretty interesting, is about future trends, which is surprisingly they're going back to older styles of beer, because apparently hipsters have taken over the industry, so everybody wants to do it the old way. So even though we've got a bunch of different things, we've got like old yeast, like communities being brought back into beer to add, different tastes and flavors, and so they're using the older fermentation.
You may not have the answer, but from the first one you're talking about with the excess, it's like the barley and the malt, etc., the hop waste. Do you know if there's any movement towards trying to use that as something? Because I imagine a lot of it possibly could be used as animal feedstock or stuff like that. I don't know if animals would like eating hops because they're quite bitter. But instead of just, sending it to landfill or something, or could it be composted? Or do you know of anyone attempting to do this? Because, I do enjoy craft beer. And if, you can make it a more sustainable, that would be good.
Yeah. So I'm just reading a bit further on. As with most articles, they don't like to, step too far into other people's things. So somebody out there should solve this issue, but they do highlight a couple of things, which is with cleaner production, they would be using steam. So it's not. They sort of focused mainly on the use of water and agricultural land, even though they mentioned the issues with toast. Not 2/3 population, environmental protection. Had it somewhere. Yeah, then it just goes on to old brewing techniques. Unfortunately, it doesn't specifically outline any ways to reduce these kinds of things, but obviously there's ways. For example, it even mentions in there that the wasted barley, which is 1/3 of the barley, could be used for bread, and it's just it's mainly having somebody who's willing to take on that third of the barley and making the bread, because it's a bit of effort to make bread on a mass production.
Yeah, maybe they should get into serving bread with the beer. Get the two of them together. Bam. Tim?
Yeah, I was actually just going to ask Simon, I suppose, a question. So that last issue that you were talking about, which is people moving back to older style of brewing and a real focus on artisanal brewing, and we obviously have an artisanal / craft brewer fan right here with Sam, and obviously myself as well. Actually, I think Simon does enjoy the occasional craft beer because we're all a bunch of hipsters. As we actually see an overall reduction, and this is in Australia, but there's been a recorded reduction in the total consumption of alcohol. Are we seeing, do you think, in some ways, people are instead of, go to the pub after work and have a couple of beers with your mates, you have, maybe 1 or 2 nights a week, you might go out to a pub and you'll have a craft beer, or you might have a very expensive beer with your meal. And the idea is now that instead of the pursuit of the experience of socializing, it's more the experience of the flavors that can come with the rich complexity of a craft beer, noting all the different things that go into the production of that process. And in that way, are we seeing sort of beer go from being something which is a more social beverage as opposed to wine, which at its peak, wine is an experiential sort of aesthetic experience that the individual wine taster goes through. Simon?
I personally would just see the movement towards more. So interestingly, what the article mentions is Neolithic beer. They're going really old school with their craft beers. But anyway, what I see with, as you're discussing, more out there kind of beer choices rather than quality over quantity, is I think it's just a whole entire. There's been this millennial movement away from mass production towards quality. And I feel like that's also, seen in the beer industry. It's seen in a lot of clothing, a lot of things where they will put more effort in if they know and they respect what's happening in the process that is being produced, opposed to just, that they can get access to it. But that's what I more see. So it's still a social aspect. It's just a different concept. Sam, you had something you want to say?
Yeah. Tying into the drop in alcohol consumption, I would be interested in one to see whether or not the total amount of money spent on alcohol has changed, because that would kind of, if you say having one beer that costs twice as much, are you actually, instead of having 2 beers that are cheap, you have one that costs more? And the change in people's, I'm going to call them, recreational habits. There's a lot more people out there just getting gacked and dancing for 18 hours straight now than there was 20 years ago. So it could be, there's a drop in alcohol consumption because of the rise in recreational substance abuse. Just a thought. And I remember, Simon, tying into that Neolithic beer thing you were talking about, I remember someone was trying to recreate, I think it was a Mesoamerican beer or something. And it actually sounds like a kind of interesting... I imagine it would probably taste like shit, truthfully. But it's an interesting thing to try,
Yeah, I do think that's interesting with regards to the potentiality of the cost of total alcohol. I suppose that links into a broader question about the aesthetic economy, how much people are willing to pay for a coffee in Australia, for instance, because they understand the quality of the coffee and the barista, but also because we're willing to have a society where a barista is paid X amount, as in usually, hopefully, at least a living wage, as opposed to, we want to drink international roast. So, there's that same sort of pursuit that we're willing, because we want to have a life with a certain type of experience, we're allowing these sort of niche industries to come into existence. Simon, you got anything to say?
Yeah, I was actually just weirdly have a question for Tim, because you have a bit more experience in this particular area. Do you feel like it's a movement away from breweries being a factory that produces beer to now breweries becoming like an experience? So, for example, you can go and visit a bar that is a brewery and they brew their beer at that location. Is it more that, from end to end, you can go to one location that's doing everything, less than in the bad old days it was, it got shipped to a particular place that was specifically for the consumption of beer, which was separated from the place that creates the beer?
I think it's kind of odd in some ways. So if you look at the history of brewing, right up until the late 19th century, brewing was largely a relatively local affair. You'd have numerous breweries in every city, and part of that had to do with the issues that Sam was talking about with regards to how long a beer can actually stay on the shelf, and transportation issues, and the availability of machinery to produce beer. As we went into the modern age, you saw a great centralization in brewing, where you'd have all these small breweries would sort of eventually be put out of production, and a large brewer would eventually service potentially an entire nation's needs. And so you had sort of, as these beers became more standardized, and you got to remember, it's a similar industry where you can point out an issue like this is actually in salt. So with salt production, initially everyone had just different types of salt that were available on the basis of how they were produced, whether it was via drying with sunlight or by heating salt water. And eventually this would come to market, and you'd have different types of salt you could buy. There was a great push during the modernist era towards a form of standardization. And what we've seen, I suppose, is a counter reaction in the postmodern experience away from standardization and back out towards diversity of experience in these products and production. Although I do also think in some ways it's also a development of pre-industrial changes to how we manufacture. So the availability of machinery, the scale and size of machinery has decreased, so that you can set up a microbrewery or a craft brewery a lot cheaper and a lot easier than what would have been available during the height of the modernist era. And as such, it's become, this is in some ways a reflection of those trends. Although I do think you're right, in some ways, from an aesthetic perspective, there has been a change in the aesthetic ideal, at least in Western and European countries, towards a craft and bespoke experience. And because you can buy a bespoke experience for yourself, it's a pursuit of something that is rare and unique to yourself.
Do you think Foster's tastes like shite just because it's our expert beer?
I have never actually drunk a Foster's, so I can't say whether or not Foster's taste like shite. But I think that is an example of the reaction against modernism. So we have a standardization. Everybody, it's like with entertainment. We have those water cooler moments when back in the day everybody was watching the Brady Bunch. All right. And so everybody could come together and talk about the same TV shows and the same experiences. But with the fracturing and the disaggregation of the media scape, same as the fracturing and disaggregation of the beverage scape, we now have the ability to go and experience and go different directions, which is great in some ways because it means that we can sort of go out and try different things. And we're moving away from something like a Foster's or a 4X, which we see as, a mainstream beer, which we don't really like. And then we can establish our own little bubbles. Now, things that come with bubbles include insularism, xenophobia, and general haughtiness. But also, I think it's something interesting to point out is that a lot of big label beers will then enter their beer as a plain label in a craft competition, so a blind tasting competition. And I know that a lot of them have performed quite well in blind tasting competition. So it does bring to the fore the question, does the industrial brewing experience that we're rebelling against, is it actually producing an inferior product, or are we just pursuing a bespoke experience? Sam?
I don't think they make an inferior product. I think technically they actually probably make a far superior product. Something to touch on what Simon mentioned about Foster's. Foster's is your classic pre-air conditioning Australian beer. So a lot of people when they first come to Australia go, holy fuck, your beer tastes like water. There's nothing to it. It's got no flavor. It's got nothing. And that's because it's fucking hot here. And you don't want, a triple hopped beer when you're out in the sun. You want something that has a bit of alcohol in it, not a whole lot of flavor, but is a bit refreshing. And that is the target for a lot of the classic, Australian beers, like your 4X, your Tui's, your Foster's, blah, 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 right? They're not terribly flavorful beers because they're not being designed that way, because they are far older than our modern environment. And a lot of these companies have massively diversified what they produce as well, because, they're powered by the invisible hand as such. They're going to sell what people want. Yeah, I forgot what I was going to say. But, all right, good stuff.
Well, thank you very much for your contribution, gentlemen. I have finished my beer, and I will get another one. For everybody out there listening, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will talk to you next time. And in the meantime, I hope that you also enjoy a beer.
This great warrior has left to his mighty Lord